Hi, my name is Nelly Ating. I'm a visual artist and a researcher. I have just concluded my PhD at Cardiff University and currently teaching visual communications at Ating University. The title of my paper or my talk today is Behind the Bars and in Front of the Camera, Winnie Mandela's Photographs in Public. I look at the performance of Winnie Mandela's photographs in both South African and British public during the anti-apartheid campaign. By public, I'm referring to South African media where these photographs originate and Amnesty's publications circulating in the transnational domain. Drawing on the performance of Winnie Mandela's photographs, I argue that these images dramatized her political activism, contributed to our understanding of apartheid states, victimization of political activists, and highlight how we continue to speak about Winnie Mandela in history. Looking at Winnie Mandela's photographs drawn in this discussion today, there is a consistent evidence that she was an active participant in molding her transnational image. Because none of these images of Winnie Mandela depicted her under the shadow of state abuse, instead, her public image is constructed as a literal refusal or defiance, quoting Tina Kamp's explanation of refusal as rejecting the status quo with the possibility of an alternative life. I should say this is a chapter from my thesis drawn from interviews I had when I visited South Africa on a research trip and spoke with anti-apartheid activists and scholars in South Africa. I'm most grateful to those who contributed to my work. I should add, most of the images I'll be sharing are from Amnesty's International Archive in London here and Drum Bailey Archive in South Africa. Sadly, it's a shame I could not join you all today due to visa issues, but we're very, very grateful to Fast Forward for making space to accommodate my talk. And I'll begin with a brief historical synopsis because it was in Amnesty's archive where I saw a memo attached detailing Winnie's detention and human rights abuse. The memo, dated January 1979, cited that Winnie Mandela and 21 others in 1969 were charged under the Suppression of Communism Act for allegedly undertaking activities on behalf of the banned African National Congress, ANC. Being mindful that the Suppression of Communism Act was very vague and a broad rule that gave the government the right to suppress who or any political activity the regime considered communist. The act later expanded into the Internal Security Act, banning and punishing any group or individual considered a threat. In fact, around 1,600 men and women between 1948 and 1999 were banned and severely restricted in their mobility, political activities, or associations. The act also helped the government overthrow groups like the ANC. Under the Suppression of Communism Act, the media were also forbidden to publicize information about political prisoners in South Africa. The memo took into account her personal life and political behavior during the censorship of access to and knowledge of events in South Africa. So one wonders how Amnesty was able to catalog with exceptional clarity and have a number of her photographs at their disposal for campaign purposes, despite Winnie facing censorship under the Suppression of Communism Act. As observed, majority of Winnie Mandela's photographs originated from South Africa, yet their circulation within the anti-apartheid transnational and public evidence a social world that fused private and public resonance. I argue that Winnie Mandela may not have been a photographer, but she was very active in framing her identity in public. For instance, one of the images of Winnie Mandela with a fist bump, which I will show later, and another framing of motherhood, which I will show later, reveal the performance as a self-representation. Each photograph of Winnie Mandela characterized her as dignified, poised, and political elite, and more so an icon. None of these images were mock shots or resembled passport photographs with a possibility of being a state document. This indicating a reproduction of a set of practices and that aim to resist a political order by conflating the private and public. I seek to understand this human rights practice of showcasing domestic snapshots in public and how it differs for political activists and for female political activists' self-preservation. According to Stuart Hall, proposed that images, concepts, and premise provide humans with framework to understand reality. Photographs enact self-representation. Rituals from production to post-production, as well as the medium we use to present ourselves. According to Judy Butler, the performative acts of rituals, when viewed as a repeated norm, can sometimes be perceived merely as an act that conceals the convention it is repeating. You can imagine an ongoing performance in this production of self. We repeat it until it becomes a recognizable visual identity and a part of our reality. This ritualistic aspect of photography not only captures important moments but also reinforces social bonds and memories within the community. Photo performance is not just the material form, but what the subject wants to say. As performance theory suggests, we all perform in society. In all of Winnie Mandela's photographs in the archive, she appeared to be prepared or posed in a photogenic way. The smiles, facial movements, arcs in in her eyebrows, her outfit were some of the visual cues. However, the awareness she embodied, the stare, gestures, and actions presumes a knowledge of the camera's presence. The enactment of such a ritualized character is a performance, and there are actors involved, such that the photographer is also aware of the focus on capturing Winnie. Perhaps each pose signals a stage photo ops for an audience or spectator. In this photographic performance, there is an awareness that Winnie's image will function beyond South Africa, and they are not oblivious to the various spectators. As Butler puts it, that performance comes from a shared social world, and this depends on and repeats a set of social relations, practices, and institutions that become part of the performance itself, no matter how unique and short-lived it is. Observing these photographs, Winnie was very aware of her status in the transnational public sphere, as I've said earlier. Whilst a documented encounter with South African activist and journalist Eric Abraham, who interviewed Winnie in 1976, may have confirmed this awareness. In this encounter, it was said that Winnie acknowledged that for the struggle, I think this was during an interview with Eric Abraham, she said that for the struggle against apartheid to be successful, it had to be made into an international cause. This exchange further affirms a consciousness of an international audience. This exchange further affirms a consciousness of an international audience. The result is also a perceptual awareness of a public. Winnie refused to be considered weak. This she alluded also during a court session documented in her memoir, where she said, "To my horrors, hot tears rolled down my cheeks in the Supreme Court. I concealed my face from the press reporters by shielding behind accused number 5's shoulder and number 4. The prospect of screaming headlines in the so-called non-white newspapers saying Mandela's wife weeps in court was not palatable." Her encounter with Abraham and court orders further suggest that Winnie had the consciousness of an audience, and her public image was important to her and to the movement. The non-white paper referenced during the court setting connotes a black audience. It shows that it was deliberate for her public image to remain defiant to her black audience, who saw her in the liberation movement as a living symbol of strength, confidence, and courage. Most importantly, her willingness to discuss her experience in solitary confinement made her a sort of inspiration, and this was part of the story that Eric Abraham published in his newsletter. Reading Winnie Mandela's photographs clarifies why the public framed her images as a symbol of defiance. In juxtaposition, her memoir becomes a prisoner's writing, also owning her political agency in discussing herself. I argue that the photograph consolidating her memoir is an act of continued historical refusal. This act of refusal is inspired by a question that Tina Kampt posed. She said, how do we write, think, perform, practice, visualize, engage, theorize, story, or enact a practice of refusal? A refusal can be literal and metaphorically, it can be visually enacted. And Kant considers such a visuality a labor of love required to cultivate, maintain, or articulate our relationship to black precarity, which may involve discomfort and potential complicity, awareness and intention to acknowledge as humans our agency creates a different reality from the one imposed from the imposed one can constitute a refusal. I propose Kant's reaction, which is a rejection of the limited subjectivity imposed and the use of a negation as a powerful force of creativity, resulting in the possibility of a different way of living. Winnie Mandela's memoir and photographs provide a visual enactment for us to articulate the performance of our agency today in transnational public. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Winnie Mandela was a public figure and rightfully presented by the media as such. To Amnesty, Winnie Mandela represented a mandate and the mission to collective action, the powerful alignment of solidarity, expressive character, and a connection to a larger advocacy interest to end apartheid in South Africa. Amnesty's mission was to defend political activists imprisoned for their opinions. Meanwhile, every one of her photographs, as seen in Amnesty's archive, seemed like Winnie Mandela conveyed an opinion through the poses. Whether she sat with her daughters or raised her hand, Winnie Mandela found a way to communicate. The inclusion of this photograph here on my screen in Amnesty's 1978 campaign publication on political imprisonment was symbolic because of the pose. The pose became a symbol of defiance and strength, serving as a visual code for political prisoners and resistance groups. In the case of Amnesty's publication, the pose chosen for the photograph of Winnie served to highlight her strength and resilience despite her political imprisonment. It is through the careful consideration of poses that photographers are able to capture not just the moment, but a powerful statement that can resonate with viewers on a much deeper level. I argue that by selecting this particular photograph, Amnesty also became a civil spectator who was called to act. As a civil spectator, Azule states that one must employ the useful civic skill of watching photographs from the day they encounter photographs of those injured. For the civil spectator, it is immediately clear that engaging with the photographs and all their elements is essential for exercising their civic skills. Amnesty had access to Winnie Mandela's case based on the popularity of her husband, Nelson Mandela, as a political prisoner in South Africa. The photograph of Winnie Mandela posed in a raised fist, denotative of a black power fist, was suggestive of defiance, well suited for performative activism. When asked how Amnesty was able to catalogue Winnie's life despite her censorship in the media, Amnesty relied on visual materials distributed by British solidarity groups such as the International Defence and AIDS Fund, gathered materials from court hearings in South Africa, used phone book randomly calling locals to get information, and funded international travels for members to attend court proceedings in South Africa. So the availability of these materials not only helps in understanding what to look at, but also who informs the activation of civic responsibility. The use of this photograph in a 1978 report on human rights abuses in South Africa reflects an exercise of civic duty, whereby meaning-making occurs between the subject, the photographer, and the viewer, who ought to be able to access stories, events, shared experiences, or be in the exact location. An unspoken trust is central to this relationship. The photograph is then the central hook. As a public figure, the pose was not necessarily that what she was doing in the picture, but also how her actions would be understood and intended to be received by a transnational audience. In this photo making of Winnie, she's an active participant, bearing similarities to photo ops. As mentioned earlier, that Winnie was very much part of framing her photographic identity. She understood her influence as an activist leader and sometimes even fell into the gender stereotype. According to Hassim, that portrayal of female politicians as nurturing reinforces gender stereotypes and impedes their political participation. For instance, the Drum Bailey archive in South Africa contains the photograph above, which depicts Winnie Mandela as a mother figure. Interestingly, Amnesty Photographic Archive also contains all the photographs of Winnie Mandela from this article, albeit seemingly different framed poses. Although the context was removed as revealed in Amnesty's archive, Winnie Mandela was now a political prisoner. Meanwhile, the context referred to a feature piece in a Drum magazine article that highlighted Winnie Mandela's intimate life as a mother and wife whilst also maintaining an insightful perspective. Despite the similarity, each archive's representation was unique, with different poses and functions. I argue again that interpretation is crucial when images circulate in public, as the differences in appearance or function of photograph bring new life to the pre-existing context. This awareness of context emphasizes the importance of Hidden Palmark and Johnny Cake's warning that photographic performances can generate complex relationships and experiences through images. It places a desired world into perspective. While Winnie Mandela may aim to be considered a political leader, she also played to the trope of being considered the mother in the public eye. It reveals a public aesthetic that tends to be dominant, masculine vision, and women themselves subject their worldview to this dominant representation. This reminds me of Dorothy Smith's feminist standpoint theory, where she argues that there is a split vision of the world women experience and the male dominant view they should adopt. Though they follow the powerful discovery of a world split apart, we learn to see, act, and speak from the ground in our experience as women. This tendency is evident in the photographs of Winnie Mandela, which was taken in 1962 by a Drum photographer. These images appeared in Drum article, which Nathaniel Nkasa wrote as a feature on Winnie's account of Nelson Mandela entitled My Man. The image is captioned, "Whatever she wears, Winnie adds her own touch of elegance." You can see baby Zinzi here, while the story evolves around Nelson Mandela. The imagery centers on Winnie and her daughters. Moreover, the framing maintains the trope of a domestic performance associated with motherhood. Winnie is portrayed not only as a mother to her two daughters, but as the mother of the nation and the keeper of the home from which her husband, along with millions of other South African men, had been unjustly banished. The photograph with her daughter was staged, resembling images produced for domestic settings, such as what could be filed into family photo albums, or hung on walls reserved for family memory, blurring the distinction between privately staged images and those intended for public consumption. One could argue that the public aesthetic guided the creation of these photographs of Winnie, ensuring a relatable public representation. It further opens up a new complexity of private-public entanglement in visual activism. Public and private debate situates the private as the home and public as area controlled by laws. This public-private discourse limits photographs embedded in the transnational system. So for me, the aim is not to study the private in opposition to the public, but rather understand their relationship. This trend is primarily due to the prevalence of certain photographic genres, such as the snapshots, which typically circulate in the private sphere, but occasionally find their way into the public. I have noticed that the banality and convention of Winnie Mandela's photographs are similar to those of snapshots or family photographs, particularly because they are intended to mediate within the private sphere. However, when a snapshot leaves the private domain, it ceases to function in a way it was intended. It becomes a trace of a personal history lost to the outsiders. The blurred boundaries between private and public photographs, such as snapshots or family photographs, offer a new perspective on the interconnectedness of these spaces, highlighting the importance of exploring their existence and influence in transnational history. The more I spent time watching this photograph, the more it struck me as a material object that should be in a family album. Judging from the different framing between published photographs on Drum and the images in Amnesty's archive, it revealed the camera movement. This camera movement seems to frame the performance of everyday ritual, such as Winnie Mandela being shown walking, sitting, smiling, and some depicting both daughters and others just one of her daughters, alluding to a regime of performativity in movement and action. However, the camera reveals that there are set conventions in this movement reproduced separately for different audiences. The photograph of Winnie Mandela walking with one of her daughters was used in the Drum article. The photograph of Winnie Mandela sitting with her two daughters was in Amnesty's archive. However, Amnesty's archive revealed a cropped photograph of the children. Of the children. However, Amnesty's archive revealed a cropped photograph of the children out of the frame, presenting Winnie Mandela as an individual figure. And on the back of the photograph was a handwritten note that read, "Sent by Defense and Aid." The use of this photograph in Amnesty's campaign or publication remains uncertain. Observingly, this photograph has gone through different types of production and reproduction, highlighting an institutional performance in public. Likewise, the reason for the children being cropped out of the frame is uncertain, but this act sheds light on the institutional usage of photographs and their perception of the performance of certain images for public consumption. There is an understanding of the representation in public. So these institutions adhere to codes that enshrine their own performance. Amnesty clearly has its performance in the public code. However, even when a performance takes place without a stage and lasts a few seconds, it always involves many individuals, objects, networks, and institutions, according to Butler. Cropped photographs aim to highlight the individuality of the political prisoner, serving as an object of public performance mediation. I argue that the recognizable feature of family photographs were a deliberate public aesthetic in the campaign against apartheid. Amnesty disseminated the images they received from the Solidarity Network. Maybe they did not have a primary control over a selection of images. For these domestic lookalike images to circulate in the transnational public sphere, it means those who procure them acknowledge that they are recognizable or identifiable feature in this photograph. It holds interpretation of family photographs that Gillian Rose sees as not just being visually innovative, but embedded in certain